Behind the towering gates and carefully guarded halls of Britain's royal residences lies a chapter of history rarely spoken aloud. Not the grand ceremonies, nor the polished portraits, but the quiet habits and private dependencies that unfolded far from public view. From laudanum-laced kings to stimulant-fueled courtly excesses, these are not the stories taught in textbooks or celebrated in official biographies. They are the ones whispered about in letters, hinted at in diaries, and quietly sealed away in marble vaults and mirrored powder rooms. Tonight, we explore the story of 15 British royals whose struggles were never meant to be known. These were not public scandals splashed across newspapers. They were private routines, discreet remedies, and carefully managed behaviours that unfolded behind palace doors, hidden beneath layers of tradition, privilege, and expectation. What began as relief often became reliance, and reliance over time became something far more dangerous. This is not a tale of judgment or sensationalism. It is a calm, historical exploration of human vulnerability beneath ceremonial titles. A reminder that even those born into unimaginable power were not immune to the pressures, isolation, and excesses of royal life. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and allow the story to unfold at an unhurried pace. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. This rabbit hole runs deep, and you won't want to miss what comes next. And while you're here, let us know where you're listening from. Is it midnight in London? 3 in the morning in New York? Or somewhere quietly awake in between? Drop a comment and tell us what time it is where you are. We're with you, night owls. Now let's begin. Number 15, Queen Victoria primary substance. Laudanum, opium tincture. Queen Victoria is rarely remembered as a figure associated with excess or indulgence. Her public image was one of duty, restraint, and moral seriousness. A monarch who defined an era through discipline and endurance. Yet behind the black dresses and rigid court etiquette was a quieter reality, one shaped by pain, loss, and the medical practices of the 19th century. It is here, in the private routines of treatment and relief, that Victoria's reliance on laudanum began. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was one of the most commonly prescribed remedies of the Victorian age. Doctors recommended it freely for anxiety, insomnia, menstrual pain, grief, digestive problems, and chronic discomfort. It was legal, respected, and widely used across all levels of society, particularly among the elite, who had constant access to physicians and pharmacists. For Queen Victoria, laudanum was not a scandalous indulgence, but a medically sanctioned companion during decades of physical and emotional strain. Victoria endured 9 pregnancies, each accompanied by significant pain and exhaustion. She suffered from recurrent insomnia, nervous agitation, and episodes of profound melancholy, particularly after the death of Prince Albert in 1861. Court correspondence and medical records suggest that opiate-based remedies were regularly administered to ease her discomfort and stabilize her mood. In an era before modern pain management, such treatments were considered compassionate and necessary. What makes Victoria's case notable is not recklessness, but duration. Her use of laudanum extended over many years, becoming a normalized part of her daily life rather than a temporary intervention. Like many long-term users of the time, she likely experienced tolerance, requiring consistent dosing to achieve the same calming effects. Yet because the substance was prescribed, refined, and socially accepted, it carried none of the stigma that would later surround opiates. There is no evidence that Victoria's use impaired her ability to rule. On the contrary, she remained mentally sharp and politically engaged well into old age. This is precisely why her story is important. It reflects how easily dependency could form in a medical culture that lacked understanding of addiction as a concept. What modern audiences might recognize as long-term reliance was, to her physicians, responsible care. Victoria's experience also set a quiet precedent. Her trust in pharmaceutical relief mirrored broader Victorian attitudes toward medicine, reinforcing the belief that discomfort, whether physical or emotional, should be treated chemically. In this way, her private habits echoed far beyond the palace, shaping a generation's relationship with pain and remedy. Queen Victoria ranks 15th, not because her behaviour was extreme, but because it was emblematic. Her story marks the beginning of a pattern repeated throughout royal history. The gradual, almost invisible slide from treatment into reliance, hidden not by secrecy, but by respectability. Number 14. King George IV. Primary substance: alcohol and laudanum. Long before he ascended the throne, King George IV, then the Prince Regent, had already earned a reputation that unsettled even the indulgent standards of Georgian high society. From an early age, his relationship with excess was not merely recreational but habitual, woven into the rhythms of his daily life. While drinking and medicinal tonics were commonplace among the elite, George's reliance on them gradually moved beyond social custom and into something far more consuming. George IV lived in an era where alcohol flowed freely at court. Wine, brandy, and fortified spirits were consumed at meals, during negotiations, and well into the night. What distinguished George was not that he drank, but how often and how heavily he did so. Contemporary observers noted that his evenings regularly stretched into dawn, accompanied by copious amounts of alcohol, lavish feasts, and little restraint. These habits were not hidden scandals. They were quiet concerns discussed in private correspondence and court gossip, carefully kept from public view. As his health began to decline, laudanum, an opium-based tincture commonly prescribed at the time, entered his routine. Doctors recommended it for pain, anxiety, digestive troubles, and insomnia, all ailments George suffered from with increasing frequency. In the medical thinking of the early 19th century, laudanum was not considered dangerous when prescribed by a physician, yet its long-term use, especially when combined with heavy drinking, carried risks that were poorly understood at the time. Over the years, George's physical condition worsened dramatically. He gained significant weight, struggled with gout, experienced breathing difficulties, and endured frequent bouts of pain that further reinforced his reliance on medicinal relief. Court records and physician notes suggest a cycle that became increasingly difficult to break. Discomfort led to treatment. Treatment led to dependency, and dependency contributed to further decline. What makes George IV's story particularly striking is how openly his excess was tolerated within the royal system, despite clear signs that his lifestyle was harming his health and impairing his judgment. The machinery of monarchy continued around him. Advisors managed affairs, physicians adjusted dosages, and the public facade remained carefully intact. The crown did not intervene. Instead, it adapted. This normalization of excess was not unique to George IV, but his position amplified its consequences. As regent and later king, his behavior influenced court culture and set an example that blurred the line between privilege and self-destruction. Yet even as whispers circulated among diplomats and nobles, official narratives focused on his patronage of the arts, his architectural projects, and his role in shaping Regency culture. In retrospect, King George IV's life reflects a moment in history when medical practice, social indulgence, and royal insulation combined in ways that allowed dependency to flourish unchecked. His story is not one of public scandal, but of gradual erosion, an illustration of how power and access could quietly sustain habits that would have drawn alarm elsewhere. Number 13. Princess Margaret primary substances: alcohol and prescription sedatives. Princess Margaret lived much of her life under an intensity of public attention that few modern royals experience so directly. As the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, she occupied a strange position, close enough to the throne to be scrutinized, yet distant enough to lack formal purpose. This imbalance shaped much of her adult life and, according to biographers and contemporaries, contributed to a reliance on alcohol and prescribed sedatives as coping mechanisms rather than indulgences. From an early age, Margaret was described as spirited, emotionally sensitive, and resistant to rigid structure. These traits clash sharply with the expectations placed upon her as a senior royal woman in the mid-20th century. Her highly publicised separation from Peter Townsend, followed by years of constrained personal freedom, left her increasingly isolated within royal life. Friends later recalled that evenings became long, repetitive, and solitary, conditions that quietly reinforced habitual behaviours. Alcohol was a common presence in royal and aristocratic social life, and Margaret's consumption was not initially viewed as unusual. Cocktail hours, private dinners, and late-night gatherings were part of her world. Over time, however, patterns emerged that concerned those closest to her. Multiple biographers have noted that drinking became less social and more routine, particularly as Margaret's health declined and her circle narrowed. Prescription sedatives entered her life largely through medical channels. Margaret suffered from chronic migraines, insomnia, and later respiratory and mobility issues. Physicians prescribed tranquilizers and sleep aids that were standard for the era and widely regarded as safe when overseen by doctors. As with many patients of the time, long-term reliance was neither openly discussed nor closely monitored, especially for someone shielded by status and discretion. The combined effect of alcohol and medication became increasingly evident as the years passed. Margaret experienced periods of fatigue, emotional volatility, and declining physical resilience. While none of this was publicly framed as dependency, private correspondence and later accounts suggest that her routines had hardened into something habitual, difficult to interrupt, and emotionally necessary. Importantly, these behaviours were not sensational scandals, but quiet adaptations to a life lived under constant restraint. What makes Princess Margaret's story particularly poignant is the contrast between her vibrant public image and her private reality. She was photographed laughing at parties, attending glamorous events, and embodying a modern royal identity. Behind the scenes, however, she struggled with boredom, frustration, and a sense of confinement that few outside the palace fully understood. Her story reflects a broader cultural moment when prescription medications were trusted implicitly, and emotional distress was often managed chemically rather than openly addressed. Within the royal system, privacy and appearance took precedence over intervention. As long as duties were fulfilled and decorum maintained, personal coping mechanisms remained largely unchallenged. Princess Margaret's inclusion on this list is not about scandal or moral judgment. It is about recognizing how environment, expectation, and access combine to create conditions where reliance could quietly deepen. Her life illustrates how even privilege offers little protection from internal struggle, especially when vulnerability must always remain out of sight. Number 12. King Edward VII. Primary substances: alcohol and stimulants. King Edward VII entered history as a symbol of indulgence, sociability, and excess, traits that stood in sharp contrast to the rigid restraint of his mother, Queen Victoria. While his reign was relatively short, his habits were long established well before he ascended the throne, shaped by decades of privilege, leisure, and near-total freedom from consequence. By the standards of his own era, Edward's behaviour was often considered improper, even alarming, not because it was secretive, but because of how openly it unfolded. Alcohol played a central role in Edward's daily routine. Heavy meals were accompanied by wine and spirits, and social engagements often extended late into the night. Drinking was deeply embedded in elite Edwardian society, yet Edward's consumption stood out for its consistency and scale. contemporary observers noted that he rarely moderated his intake, even as age and health began to impose physical limits. Court insiders privately expressed concern, though such worries were carefully muted in public narratives. Alongside alcohol, Edward relied on various stimulants and restorative tonics that were fashionable among the upper classes. These substances, often prescribed or recommended by physicians, were marketed as aids for energy, digestion, and vitality. In an era before strict regulation, such compounds could include caffeine-heavy mixtures and other chemical stimulants intended to counteract fatigue. For Edward, they helped sustain a demanding social calendar that left little room for rest. The combination created a familiar cycle: late nights fueled by alcohol, followed by stimulants to restore alertness and maintain appearances. Over time, this pattern took a visible toll. Edward struggled with weight, circulation issues, and respiratory problems, yet his routines remained largely unchanged. Rather than encouraging restraint, his environment adjusted to accommodate him. Meetings shortened, schedules softened, expectations lowered. What distinguishes Edward VII's story is not secrecy, but normalization. His habits were widely known within aristocratic circles and even joked about in private correspondence. Yet intervention was rare. As Prince of Wales, he was famously difficult to restrain, and by the time he became king, his patterns were deeply entrenched. Physicians focused on managing symptoms rather than addressing underlying behaviors. Despite this, Edward maintained a reputation as a charismatic host and cultural patron. He was celebrated for easing diplomatic tensions through social engagement and for ushering in a more relaxed royal atmosphere. These accomplishments often overshadowed the quieter reality of declining health and reliance on chemical support to sustain his lifestyle. Edward VII's inclusion here reflects a broader truth about royal life at the turn of the 20th century. Excess was not merely tolerated, it was institutionalized. Access to substances, medical discretion, and social insulation combined to create conditions where dependence could persist without challenge. His story is a reminder that vulgarity, by historical standards, did not always mean shocking acts or public disgrace. Sometimes it meant living without restraint in a world that quietly enabled it. For Edward VII, indulgence became identity, and habit became legacy. Number 11. King Charles II. Primary substances: alcohol and experimental tonics. King Charles II ruled during a period of restoration, not only of the monarchy, but of excess, pleasure, and personal freedom after years of Puritan restraint. When he returned to the throne in 1660, England entered an era defined by loosened morals, revived court life, and indulgence that was both cultural and personal. Within this environment, Charles II's habits were not merely tolerated, they were quietly embedded in the identity of his reign. Alcohol was a constant presence in Charles's daily life. Wine, brandy, and fortified spirits were consumed routinely at court, often beginning early in the day and extending long into the night. Drinking was deeply social and ceremonial, but contemporaries frequently remarked on Charles's lack of moderation. Diplomatic letters and court diaries describe a king who preferred conviviality over discipline, often conducting state matters amid feasts and entertainment rather than formal restraint. Beyond alcohol, Charles II became increasingly reliant on a range of experimental medicinal tonics. 17th century medicine was an uncertain blend of science, superstition, and chemical experimentation. Physicians prescribed elixirs intended to restore vitality, improve digestion, and ward off illness, many containing alcohol, mercury compounds, or herbal narcotics. These treatments were considered progressive for the time, especially for a monarch eager to embrace new ideas. Charles encouraged experimentation not only on himself but within his court. He was fascinated by early chemistry and supported physicians who promoted unconventional remedies. While this curiosity aligned with the intellectual spirit of the Restoration, it also exposed him to repeated dosing with substances whose long-term effects were poorly understood. Over time, medicinal use blurred into routine reliance, particularly as Charles aged and his health declined. Observers noted that Charles often appeared fatigued, yet resistant to rest. Rather than slowing down, his court adjusted around him. Duties were condensed, advisors carried greater responsibility, and physicians refined treatments to sustain his pace. The goal was not correction, but continuity, maintaining the image of a lively, accessible king, despite mounting physical strain. What makes Charles II's story particularly notable is how openly indulgence was woven into governance itself. His court became synonymous with pleasure, tolerance, and excess, setting a tone that contrasted sharply with earlier expectations of royal austerity. While this cultural shift brought relief to a nation weary of restriction, it also normalized behaviors that, by earlier standards, would have been considered deeply improper. Despite this, Charles avoided public disgrace. His charisma, political instincts, and ability to deflect criticism protected him from serious backlash. Dependency, when it existed, was framed as personality rather than problem. The monarchy, once again, absorbed the behaviour rather than confronting it. King Charles II's inclusion on this list reflects a moment when royal vulgarity took the form of indulgent normalcy. Excess was not hidden, it was institutional. His reign demonstrates how power, curiosity, and access can quietly foster reliance, especially when restraint is neither demanded nor desired. Number 10. Queen Elizabeth I. Primary substances. Medicinal alcohols and potions. Queen Elizabeth I, the iconic Virgin Queen of England, ruled from 1558 to 1603, overseeing political stability, cultural flourishing, and the establishment of English influence abroad. Yet beneath her poised exterior, she relied heavily on medicinal alcohols and restorative potions, a habit both typical for her era and extraordinary in its extent. These substances, often containing potent stimulants, sedatives, or opiates mixed with wine or brandy, were used to manage fatigue, insomnia, digestive issues, and other chronic ailments, reflecting the medical understanding of Tudor England. Elizabeth's reliance was deeply intertwined with the pressures of monarchy. As the Queen navigated court politics, foreign threats, and the demands of her advisors, these potions allowed her to maintain composure, energy, and stamina. Court physicians closely monitored her doses, which were often taken as part of a structured daily regimen. Ambassadors and chroniclers of the time observed the Queen receiving her remedies discreetly, emphasizing that her use was accepted, normalized, and considered necessary for the exercise of her duties. What makes Elizabeth's habits particularly notable from a modern perspective is the hidden dependence on substances now recognized as potentially addictive. Tudor medicine blurred the line between nourishment, treatment, and stimulation, and Elizabeth's frequent consumption of fortified elixirs and medicinal alcohols reflects both a practical approach to health and the extraordinary stresses of ruling alone as a female monarch in a male-dominated political world. Her habits allowed her to endure long days of council, correspondence, and ceremonial obligations, all while maintaining the public image of a strong, unflappable sovereign. Elizabeth's use of potions also illustrates the intersection of secrecy, power, and health. While her advisors, courtiers, and foreign observers noted her practices, there was no scandal attached. Her routines were integrated into the very performance of kingship. In many ways, these substances underpinned her capacity to govern effectively, acting as quiet tools of survival amid the immense demands placed upon her. Ultimately, Queen Elizabeth I's story offers a window into how the personal habits of monarchs were inseparable from their public responsibilities. The medicinal alcohols and restorative potions she relied on were ordinary for her time, yet extraordinary in how they shaped her reign and endurance. They allowed a queen to maintain control, project authority, and navigate decades of political and personal challenges, revealing that even the most legendary figures sometimes depended on hidden, continuous aids to sustain their legendary presence. Number 9. King James I. Primary substances. Alcohol. King James I of England, who reigned from 1603 to 1625, is remembered for commissioning the King James Bible and navigating the early Stuart court. Yet one of the more unusual aspects of his reign was his notable reliance on alcohol. Contemporary observers frequently remarked on James's drinking habits, which ranged from casual indulgence to excessive consumption, influencing both his health and public comportment. Alcohol was a constant presence in James's daily life. Wine, ale, and fortified spirits were consumed in the morning, during meals, and late into the evening. Unlike ceremonial toasts or social drinking, James often drank to the point of visible impairment, particularly during private meals or informal gatherings. Letters, diaries, and ambassadorial reports from the period repeatedly reference the king's habitual potations, describing both the frequency and the effects on his demeanour. In public, he maintained composure, but in private, his behaviour could become unpredictable, affecting advisors, courtiers, and family alike. This reliance was partly a reflection of the period. Alcohol was commonly used for medicinal purposes, as a stimulant, and as a daily dietary staple, especially in a climate where water was often unsafe to drink. For James, however, it appears that drinking extended beyond necessity into habitual indulgence. Observers described him as fond of multiple glasses, often taking them in quick succession, which sometimes led to slurred speech, irritability, or visible fatigue. Such episodes created challenges within the court, as the king's temper and attention could fluctuate with his consumption. James's drinking habits also had political implications. Court officials learned to navigate his moods, tailoring advice and proceedings to times when he was most alert and cooperative. His indulgence occasionally affected diplomatic interactions. Ambassadors noted that extended drinking could disrupt official discussions or ceremonial events. Despite this, James's reliance on alcohol was socially tolerated, normalized by contemporary attitudes toward moderation and the medicinal value attributed to wine and spirits. What makes James I's story particularly fascinating is the blend of public authority and private habit. A monarch wielding immense power was simultaneously vulnerable to the effects of alcohol, illustrating how even the highest-ranking individuals were shaped by personal habits. This reliance, though unremarkable in context, becomes bizarre when viewed through modern eyes. A king so intelligent, politically astute, and cultured was also dependent on a daily substance to manage the pressures of life and rule. Ultimately, King James I's drinking habits remind us that human behaviour under monarchy often blends necessity, indulgence, and coping. Alcohol was both a tool and a vulnerability, shaping moods, decision-making, and court life. In examining his reliance, we gain insight into the hidden dimensions of a king whose brilliance and eccentricity were inseparable from the substances that quietly accompanied him throughout his reign. Number 8. Prince Albert Victor. Primary substances: alcohol and rumoured opiates. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of Edward VII, lived a life marked by privilege, expectation and fragility. Born into the heart of the British monarchy, he was groomed for kingship, yet his personal life was shadowed by delicate health and rumoured reliance on substances to cope with physical and emotional strain. Contemporary accounts and later biographers note that alcohol and sedative substances were used both to manage his ailments and to ease the pressures of royal life, making him one of the more enigmatic figures in modern royal history. Albert Victor's physical constitution was notoriously fragile. Chronic illness, frequent infections, and an overall sensitive disposition meant that he required medical attention throughout much of his life. Physicians often prescribed tonics, fortified wines, or sedative medicines to calm agitation, ease pain, and sustain energy. While these substances were not unusual in the context of the time, the consistency and frequency of their use suggest a dependence born more of necessity than of indulgence, blurring the lines between medical treatment and habitual reliance. In addition to alcohol as a restorative, there are whispers among historians of opiate-based remedies being administered to manage pain, stress, or sleep disturbances. Though documentation is limited, understandably so for a young prince whose health was closely guarded, these accounts are consistent with medical practices in late Victorian and Edwardian England, when opiates were a common, socially sanctioned solution for chronic ailments. Such reliance reflects the challenges faced by a royal whose status demanded public appearances, formal engagement, and the maintenance of composure despite physical limitations. Albert Victor's habits also intersected with the intense social pressures of royalty. Expectations for comportment, education, and duty were immense, and the young prince's retreat into substances, whether medicinal or recreational, demonstrates the human strategies for coping with inherited responsibility. Observers of the time noted moments of fatigue or melancholy, which may have been exacerbated by his regimen of tonics and alcohol, highlighting the tension between youthful vulnerability and the public persona of royal strength. Ultimately, Prince Albert Victor's story is a reminder that the trappings of royalty often conceal personal struggle. While he did not live long enough to ascend the throne, the substances he relied upon shaped his daily existence, health, and social interactions. Alcohol and sedatives, administered under medical supervision, illustrate how dependency could quietly exist within the royal household. Normalized, discreet, and essential for sustaining life under extraordinary pressure. His life, though tragically short, offers a fascinating glimpse into the hidden realities behind the ceremonial and glamorous exterior of monarchy. Number 7. King Henry IV. Primary substances. Pain relief potions. King Henry IV of England, who reigned from 1399 to 1413, is often remembered for his tumultuous ascent to the throne and the political instability of his reign. Yet behind the turmoil of crown and court lay a deeply personal struggle, chronic illness that required frequent medicinal intervention. Henry's reliance on pain relief potions, common treatments of the time, shaped both his daily life and the perception of his health, offering a fascinating glimpse into the intersection of medieval medicine, royal duty, and personal vulnerability. Henry suffered from long-term physical ailments, which modern historians speculate may have included digestive disorders, joint pain, and a range of stress-related conditions exacerbated by the pressures of kingship. Contemporary accounts indicate that his physicians administered repeated doses of herbal remedies and alcohol-based potions designed to alleviate pain and improve digestion. While these substances were considered therapeutic, their repeated use, sometimes multiple times daily, effectively placed the king in a cycle of dependence, where relief and the risk of overuse coexisted in an uneasy balance. The use of these potions was not only a personal matter, but also a political concern. Henry's health was of national importance. A visibly ill or incapacitated king could embolden rivals and destabilize governance. Chronic pain and fatigue influenced how he conducted court business, attended councils, and managed military campaigns. Advisors and physicians were acutely aware that the king's reliance on medicinal substances was necessary for him to maintain functionality, yet it also underscored his human fragility. Henry IV's case is particularly notable because it illustrates how early medicinal practices blurred the line between treatment and habitual reliance. Pain relief potions contained potent ingredients, sometimes alcohol, herbs with narcotic effects, or early chemical compounds that would today be recognized as having addictive potential. For a king under constant stress, These substances offered temporary respite, but also became a structural part of his daily life, quietly influencing mood, energy, and decision-making. Ultimately, King Henry IV's story is a window into the hidden realities of medieval monarchy. His reliance on pain relief potions was medically justified, socially accepted, and discreetly managed, yet it also represents one of the more human aspects of kingship. A ruler subject to the same vulnerabilities, discomforts, and dependencies as those he governed. It reminds us that even the most powerful figures were shaped not only by ambition and authority, but by the physical limitations of their bodies and the substances used to sustain them. Number 6. King George III. Primary substances: medicinal compounds, mercury, opiates. King George III of England, who reigned from 1760 to 1820, is often remembered for his long rule and the loss of the American colonies. Yet one of the most remarkable and bizarre aspects of his life was his reliance on medicinal compounds, ranging from opiates to mercury treatments, prescribed to manage both physical and mental ailments. These substances, intended to treat everything from fevers and digestive issues to the symptoms of porphyria, frequently blurred the line between therapy and dependency, profoundly impacting his daily life and governance. George's medical regimen was extensive. Chronic bouts of illness and the symptoms of porphyria, thought to include abdominal pain, fatigue, and psychological disturbances, led physicians to prescribe a wide range of remedies. Laudanum and other opiate tinctures were administered to ease pain and promote sleep, while mercury compounds were used to treat fevers, digestive complaints, and other chronic conditions. These treatments were standard for the period, yet the frequency and cumulative effects of repeated dosing created a reliance that historians today recognize as a form of medical dependency. The king's use of these compounds had both personal and political consequences. Periods of severe illness could render him incapacitated, leaving ministers to manage affairs of state in his absence. Even during less severe episodes, his reliance on opiates and other remedies influenced his energy, mood, and decision-making, subtly affecting the rhythm of governance. Chroniclers noted that while George could appear vigorous and composed at times, he was also prone to fatigue, irritability, or prolonged periods of subdued activity, often coinciding with his treatment schedule. What makes George III's case particularly notable is how treatment itself could worsen the situation. Mercury compounds, for example, could induce toxicity and exacerbate physical discomfort, while repeated use of opiates could dull cognition and create tolerance. In attempting to manage illness, the king and his physicians inadvertently entrenched a cycle of reliance that was both hidden and normalized within the royal household. This quiet dependence illustrates how medical practices, societal expectations, and the pressures of monarchy could converge to produce bizarre patterns of behavior that were neither scandalous nor indulgent, but profoundly human. Ultimately, King George III's story is a stark reminder of the vulnerability behind the crown. Medicinal compounds allowed him to endure the physical and psychological demands of rulership, yet they also illustrate the thin boundary between treatment and dependency. His reliance was a product of circumstance, medical knowledge of the era, and the weight of authority, offering a compelling window into the hidden, sometimes bizarre realities of life at the pinnacle of power. Number 5. Queen Anne. Primary substances: laudanum and alcohol. Queen Anne of Great Britain, who reigned from 1702 to 1714, faced a life marked by personal tragedy, chronic illness, and relentless pressure as monarch. Among the lesser-known but striking aspects of her reign was her frequent reliance on laudanum and alcohol to manage physical pain and emotional distress. These substances, prescribed for ailments ranging from gout and digestive issues to insomnia and anxiety, were deeply intertwined with her daily life, quietly shaping the experience of her rule. Anne endured an extraordinary number of personal losses, including the deaths of 17 children, several of whom died in infancy. The emotional toll was immense, and court records indicate that her physicians regularly administered laudanum, a tincture of opium, alongside fortified wines and other alcohol-based remedies. These substances were intended to provide relief from pain, calm nerves, and improve sleep, yet their repeated use contributed to a subtle but persistent dependence, reflecting both the medical culture of the time and the intense demands placed upon a grieving queen. The effects of these substances were both physical and psychological. Laudanum could dull pain and induce calm, while alcohol served as both tonic and comfort. Chronic dosing, however, may have exacerbated her fatigue, mood fluctuations, and susceptibility to illness. Observers noted periods when Anne appeared unusually subdued or lethargic, particularly following extended treatments. Yet these interventions also allowed her to maintain the appearance of stability and composure expected of a monarch, demonstrating how substances became integrated into the management of both personal health and public duty. Anne's reliance highlights a broader pattern in early 18th century medicine, where opiates and alcohol were routinely used for symptom management, without clear understanding of long-term consequences. For a queen balancing statecraft, court politics, and constant grief, these remedies offered a discreet means of sustaining her energy and emotional equilibrium. While her use was medically sanctioned and socially acceptable, it nonetheless illustrates the subtle ways that dependency could exist behind the polished veneer of monarchy. Ultimately, Queen Anne's story is both human and revealing. Her use of laudanum and alcohol reflects a pragmatic response to chronic pain, emotional strain, and the extraordinary pressures of rulership. It underscores how even the most powerful figures were shaped by their bodies, their vulnerabilities, and the remedies available to them. Through this lens, Anne's reign becomes not only a story of political achievement, but also a portrait of resilience, where the hidden reliance on substances allowed a grieving, ailing queen to continue fulfilling her duties and leaving an enduring mark on British history. Number 4. King Henry VIII. Primary substances: alcohol and medicinal drugs. King Henry VIII of England, who reigned from 1509 to 1547, is one of history's most infamous monarchs, remembered for his 6 marriages, political upheaval, and dramatic religious reforms. Yet alongside the scandals and monumental decisions was a less discussed, bizarre aspect of his life: a pronounced reliance on alcohol and medicinal drugs, particularly during the later years of his reign. These substances, intended to manage pain, inflammation, and fatigue, became a regular part of daily life, influencing both his health and his behaviour. Henry's later years were marked by chronic illness. Obesity, leg ulcers, and possible metabolic disorders caused persistent discomfort, restricting mobility and generating severe pain. Physicians of the time prescribed an array of remedies, including opiates, herbal tonics, and alcohol-based compounds, to alleviate his symptoms. Wine, ale, and fortified spirits were not only consumed socially, but also incorporated into medicinal treatments, blurring the line between therapeutic use and habitual indulgence. This combination of substances provided temporary relief, but also fostered dependence, a pattern common among the sickly elite of Tudor England. Alcohol played a particularly central role in managing both physical and mental strain. Chronic pain, insomnia, and stress from political and personal pressures were often mitigated through drinking. Observers described Henry as heavily reliant on wine to endure the rigours of court life, which included administrative duties, ceremonial obligations, and military campaigns. His consumption was routine, frequent, and integrated into the structured life of the palace, reflecting both the medical culture of the era and the extraordinary pressures of kingship. Henry's use of medicinal drugs further illustrates the precarious balance between treatment and dependence. Remedies containing opiates or other potent compounds were intended to relieve pain, promote sleep, and improve digestion, yet repeated dosing likely contributed to fatigue, mood swings, and diminished physical resilience. Chroniclers noted that his temperament could fluctuate unpredictably, particularly when unwell, demonstrating how substance reliance subtly influenced his public demeanour and private conduct. Ultimately, King Henry VIII's story reveals the hidden realities of royal life. Alcohol and medicinal drugs were essential tools for managing the extraordinary physical and emotional demands of monarchy, yet they also highlight the strange, often overlooked ways dependence could develop. His experiences remind us that even the most powerful and notorious rulers were human, vulnerable to pain, and reliant on substances to maintain functionality. Through these habits, we glimpse a king whose health challenges shaped not only his personal behaviour, but the rhythms and management of Tudor governance itself. Number 3. Prince Regent George, later George IV. Primary substances: opium, alcohol, and stimulants. Prince George, who later became King George IV, is widely remembered for his extravagant lifestyle, opulent tastes, and flamboyant personality. Yet behind the glittering facade was a deeply concerning reliance on multiple substances, including opium, alcohol, and various stimulants. His habits, which developed over decades, were closely tied to the pressures of public expectation, chronic discomfort, and a desire to maintain the energy and presence required of a monarch in waiting. George's dependence on opium, typically administered as laudanum, was central to his daily routine. This opiate-based remedy was commonly used in the late 18th and early 19th centuries for pain relief, insomnia, and emotional stress. For George, who struggled with physical complaints, including digestive issues, fatigue, and possibly mental health fluctuations, laudanum provided a manageable, if temporary, escape from discomfort. Its frequent use, however, blurred the line between medical treatment and long-term dependence, creating cycles of tolerance that required escalating doses over time. Alcohol was another key element of George's substance use. Wine, brandy, and fortified spirits were consumed throughout the day, both socially and privately, often in combination with opiates. Chronic alcohol consumption amplified the effects of other substances, affected mood and energy levels, and contributed to the noticeable decline in his physical health during his later years. Stimulants, though less documented, were occasionally used to counteract fatigue or support the prince's notorious social schedule, which included late-night gatherings, extravagant balls, and extended ceremonial duties. George's reliance on these substances was both functional and emblematic of his personality. He sought stimulation to endure endless public appearances and social obligations, as well as relief from the physical and psychological toll of chronic health issues. Observers of the time noted the king's erratic behaviour, flamboyant spending, and excessive indulgence, all of which were exacerbated, though not solely caused, by his chemical dependence. Chronic dosing allowed him to maintain the appearance of vigour and command, even as it quietly undermined his resilience. The Prince Regent's story illustrates how substance dependence can be interwoven with the performance of royalty. His habits were medically sanctioned, socially tolerated, and often concealed, yet they profoundly affected both his body and his reputation. George's life offers a stark reminder that behind public spectacle, power, and ceremony, even the most visible figures could be quietly reliant on substances to sustain their roles. The combination of opium, alcohol, and stimulants created a pattern of dependence that was normalized, hidden, and deeply influential over the trajectory of his reign. Number 2. King Charles II. Primary substances: experimental drugs and alcohol. King Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, is often celebrated for restoring the monarchy after years of civil war and Puritan rule. Yet his later years reveal a more troubling and bizarre side, a heavy reliance on experimental drugs and alcohol. As he aged, the king's health declined, and physicians increasingly administered a variety of chemical remedies, sometimes innovative, sometimes dangerously untested, to manage pain, fatigue, and chronic ailments. These treatments, combined with his habitual alcohol consumption, created a pattern of dependency that shaped both his personal life and his court. Alcohol remained central to Charles's daily existence. Wine, brandy, and fortified spirits were consumed throughout meals, social gatherings, and private moments, providing comfort, stimulation, and social lubrication. Chronic consumption affected his mood, energy, and public demeanor, but it was widely tolerated by court observers, considered both a personal indulgence and a tool for sustaining the king's sociable, accessible persona. Alcohol also functioned in combination with medicinal compounds, enhancing effects or dulling discomfort caused by illness or experimental treatments. Charles's experimentation with drugs was particularly notable. 17th century medicine was a mixture of superstition, early chemistry, and trial and error practice. Physicians prescribed elixirs containing opiates, mercury, or herbal compounds, sometimes in combination, with the goal of restoring vitality, relieving pain, or countering perceived imbalances in the body. Charles, intrigued by new ideas and eager to maintain energy and presence, participated willingly in these regimens. Over time, repeated dosing blurred the distinction between medical necessity and reliance, particularly as treatments produced both relief and side effects that required further management. The king's dependence was further complicated by the demands of rule. Charles's reign required constant attention to political intrigue, foreign diplomacy, and public appearances. Chronic illness combined with chemical reliance created cycles of vulnerability, yet the court adapted around him. Advisors adjusted schedules, ceremonial duties were modified, and physicians refined treatments to sustain his capacity to govern. The result was a hidden network supporting both the king and his chemical dependencies, often invisible to the public eye. What makes Charles II's late life habits particularly shocking is the combination of curiosity, indulgence, and necessity. He embraced experimental remedies that were untested, potent, and potentially dangerous, all while maintaining the heavy social drinking expected of his role. This dual reliance underscores how personal habits, medical culture, and royal duty intersected to produce patterns of substance use that were both normalized and extraordinary. Ultimately, Charles II's story highlights the strange realities behind the facade of monarchy, a powerful ruler simultaneously reliant on substances to endure the pressures of age, authority, and expectation. His experimental drug use and alcohol consumption illustrate the hidden vulnerabilities of even the most celebrated monarchs, offering a glimpse into a life where indulgence and dependency were inseparable from the demands of kingship. Number 1. Queen Victoria, Late Reign Deep Dive. Primary substances. Laudanum. Queen Victoria is unique on this list, appearing twice. A surprising but revealing testament to the depth and persistence of her reliance on laudanum. She first appears at number 15 for her early use of the opium-based tincture to manage pain, insomnia, and anxiety, a socially accepted, medically sanctioned practice common among the elite of Victorian Britain. Yet as the years progressed, her dependence intensified, becoming a hidden, long-term feature of her daily life, which is why she claims the number 1 spot in this countdown. Victoria's late-life reliance on laudanum grew particularly pronounced after the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861. Overwhelmed by grief, chronic headaches, fatigue, and other physical ailments, she increasingly turned to the tincture, which eased both emotional and physical discomfort. What may have begun as a practical remedy evolved into a habitual, almost invisible support system that allowed her to maintain authority, composure, and the endless duties of a monarch. While early dosing was controlled and socially normalized, the later decades of her reign reveal a pattern of repeated long-term use, what some historians describe as a quiet epidemic of opiate dependence among the upper class. This second, deeper reliance is what elevates Victoria to number one. In her later years, laudanum was not merely an occasional comfort, but an essential component of sustaining her role as sovereign. It allowed her to endure the pressures of court, diplomacy, and ceremonial duties while managing grief and chronic pain. Despite the severity of her dependence, Victoria maintained the public appearance of dignity and resilience, illustrating the extraordinary lengths she went to in order to uphold her responsibilities. The dual presence of Queen Victoria on this list underscores the subtle but profound ways substance use shaped royal life. Early use was medically justified and socially accepted, while later use became a chronic reliance that quietly influenced behavior, mood, and energy. Her story offers a rare lens into how personal vulnerability and the burdens of monarchy intersect, and how a substance normalized in elite culture could evolve into a hidden, enduring dependency. Ultimately, Victoria's life demonstrates that even the most revered figures in history were not immune to the pressures of body and mind, and that the substances they relied upon could both sustain and quietly shape their reigns. Her dual listing, first for initiation, then for chronic dependency, makes her the most striking example of a royal whose private reliance on laudanum quietly influenced decades of British history. Royalty often seems distant, a world of ceremony, tradition, and carefully constructed image. Yet the stories we've explored today remind us that behind every crown were individuals who were deeply human, sometimes fragile, sometimes obsessive, and often struggling in ways that were invisible to their subjects and the world. From chronic reliance on opiates like laudanum to indulgent consumption of alcohol, experimental tonics, and stimulants, these 15 royals reveal the hidden vulnerabilities and coping mechanisms that shaped their lives, their courts, and even the course of history. What is striking about these stories is the intersection of privilege and human necessity. For some, substances were prescribed remedies, socially and medically sanctioned, a means to endure pain, insomnia, or grief. For others, indulgence and habit blurred into dependence, creating private struggles that were quietly managed within the opulent walls of palaces and estates. Queen Victoria, appearing twice on our list, illustrates this perfectly. Her early use of laudanum gradually evolving into a long-term reliance that sustained her through grief, chronic illness, and decades of relentless responsibility. In her case, and in many others, substance use was not mere escapism. It was an essential tool for maintaining the image, authority, and functionality expected of a monarch. These addictions also offer insight into the pressures of court life. Chronic illness, personal loss, political responsibility, and the constant scrutiny of advisors, subjects, and foreign diplomats created an environment in which coping mechanisms became normalized. Alcohol, opiates, and experimental compounds allowed these royals to navigate duties that might otherwise have been impossible. Yet the very substances that supported their reigns also shaped their behaviors, moods, and decisions, influencing both private and public life in subtle but profound ways. What emerges from these 15 accounts is a pattern of human resilience, adaptation, and sometimes tragic dependence. The eccentricities, obsessions, and indulgences of kings, queens, and princes were rarely frivolous. They were strategies for survival under extreme pressures. They remind us that power does not erase vulnerability, and that behind every carefully posed portrait or stately ceremony, there were private battles fought in secret, often with substances that society of the time deemed acceptable or necessary. If this journey through the hidden addictions of Britain's most extraordinary royals fascinated you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a look at the unusual, intimate, and utterly captivating lives of history's most remarkable figures. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of power, vulnerability, and the complex humanity behind monarchy. May your curiosity about the past continue to be bold, unrestrained, and unforgettable, just like the kings, queens, and princes we've uncovered today.